Somewhere in ancient Mesopotamia, a priest is carving a story into wet clay about a man who builds a boat to survive a flood sent to wipe out humanity. Thousands of miles away, in ancient China, storytellers are describing a great deluge that covers the land for years, requiring a hero to reshape the earth itself just to make it livable again. Cross the ocean, long before anyone in the Americas had contact with Europe or Asia, and you'll find indigenous nations from the Pacific Northwest to the Andes telling their own stories. Floods that drown the old world, survivors clinging to mountains or canoes, a fresh start granted to whoever remains. Here's what should stop you in your tracks. These civilizations had no contact with each other. No shared alphabet, no trade routes connecting Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, no ancient internet spreading the same viral story across continents. And yet, somehow, they're all telling versions of the same tale. A great flood, a vanishing world, a handful of survivors, a second chance at being human. So, what's actually going on here? Is this some kind of shared memory buried deep in our collective past, pointing to a real disaster so massive it reshaped how every culture on Earth understood catastrophe? Or is it something else entirely? Maybe our ancestors, scattered across every continent, just kept running into floods, because that's what happens on a planet covered mostly in water, and eventually similar disasters produce similar stories. Or maybe, and this is the one that really gets under your skin, our brains are simply wired to tell certain kinds of stories. Stories about endings and beginnings, about the world being wiped clean and remade. Maybe the flood isn't about water at all, maybe it's about us. We're going to dig into all three of these possibilities tonight. No forcing one tidy answer, no easy conclusions. Just a slow, careful walk through what we actually know, what we suspect, and what remains genuinely mysterious. If you're settling in to fall asleep to this, that's exactly the point. That's why these get made. So go ahead, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I really do read these. It's strange and wonderful realizing someone's hearing this in Lisbon at midnight, while someone else is starting their morning coffee in Manila. This whole thing connects people in ways that still catches me off guard. If you'd rather have a completely ad-free, music-free version to drift off to, I've got this available on Spotify as well. Following there helps support the work more than you'd think. And if you're enjoying these, a 5-star review genuinely makes a difference in keeping this going. Links down in the description whenever you're ready. Tonight, we're going on a long, slow tour. Mesopotamia first, then into the Hebrew tradition, over to Greece across South Asia, into China, through the islands of the Pacific, and eventually all the way into the Americas and Africa. Civilization after civilization, each with their own flood, their own hero, their own reasons for remembering it the way they do. Then, once we've heard their stories, we'll turn to the evidence. Geology, ancient climate records, migration patterns, the slow science of figuring out whether myths like these point to something that actually happened or something far stranger. Something about how the human mind processes loss, change, and survival itself. Let's start at the beginning, back when the world quite literally was drowning. Before we go any further, we need to slow down and ask a question that sounds simple but actually isn't. When we say two cultures have the same flood story, what do we actually mean by that? Because if we're not careful here, we'll end up seeing patterns that aren't really there, or worse, missing the ones that actually matter. So let's break down what these stories are usually built from. Almost every flood myth we're about to explore contains some combination of the same basic pieces. A divine warning, some god or spirit deciding humanity has become too loud, too violent, too forgetful, and choosing to start over. A chosen survivor, someone deemed worthy, or sometimes just lucky, who receives instructions before the water comes. a boat or ark built to exact specifications, carrying not just people but animals, sometimes seeds, sometimes the memory of an entire world. A landing on a mountain, because water rises, and high ground is where the story has to end. And finally, some kind of new agreement, a covenant, a promise, a fresh set of rules for how the survivors are supposed to live now that they've been given a second chance. Divine warning, chosen survivor, ark, animals, mountain, new beginning. 6 building blocks, and here's where things get tricky. When you see all 6 lined up together, like you do in Mesopotamia, and later in the Hebrew Bible, that's a striking match, specific enough that it's hard to write off as coincidence. But when you only see 1 or 2 of these elements, a mountain landing here, a boat there, that's not necessarily the same story at all. It might just be 2 cultures independently arriving at the most logical way to imagine surviving rising water. Because let's be honest, if your world was flooding, what would you do? You'd go up, you'd build something that floats, you'd try to save whatever animals and food you could. These aren't exotic ideas, they're the obvious ones. This is why comparative mythologists are so careful about distinguishing between broad universal themes, the kind any culture near water might invent on its own, and specific rare matches, oddly particular details that show up in 2 traditions with no plausible reason for coincidence. A flood happening at all, common, a specific list of measurements for a boat or a bird sent out to check if the water's receded, that starts looking like something else entirely, maybe shared memory, maybe shared origin, maybe actual contact somewhere down the line. We also need to be careful with our vocabulary. Myth, legend, and cultural memory aren't insults. They're not synonyms for made up. A myth can carry real historical residue wrapped in symbolic language. A legend can preserve an actual event while exaggerating its scale. And cultural memory, that's something different again. A kind of intergenerational retelling that keeps a real experience alive long after anyone who lived through it is gone, even as details shift and drift with each new storyteller. So here's the guardrail we're going to carry with us for the rest of tonight. Similarities can suggest a shared human experience, real disasters, real anxieties, real memories passed down. But they can't prove a single global event on their own. What they can do is point us toward genuine questions one's geology, archaeology, and history might actually help answer. And that's exactly where we're headed, starting in the oldest flood story we have written down. When we say the oldest flood story we have written down, we're talking about Mesopotamia. Clay tablets, cuneiform wedges, scribes sitting in hot rooms along the Tigris and Euphrates, pressing reeds into wet mud. Long before Noah, before Greek poets, before philosophers in India, people in what is now Iraq were already writing about a world-destroying flood and the one person who survived it. One of the earliest versions we have is called Atrahasis. The name basically means exceedingly wise, which tells you what kind of guy he's supposed to be. The story opens not with water but with noise. Humanity has multiplied. Cities are growing, people are loud, restless, and from the gods' point of view, exhausting. In this story, the gods are not omnipotent, serene beings. They get hungry, they get tired, they complain. The lesser gods are doing the hard labour of maintaining creation, digging canals, managing irrigation, keeping the cosmic machinery running. Eventually they revolt. They're done being cosmic ditch diggers. The senior gods, led by Enlil, decide the solution is simple: create humans to shoulder the work. At first, this works. Humans take over the heavy lifting. The junior gods get a break. But as human populations grow, the noise returns. Enlil can't sleep. He tries a series of population control measures. First, there's a plague. When that doesn't do enough, there's a famine, then a drought. Each time, another god, Enki, quietly intervenes, slipping secret messages to Atrahasis, teaching him how to outsmart the catastrophe. Make offerings here, change your diet there, divert the worst of the disaster. Finally, Enlil loses patience. No more half measures. He decides on a full reset, a flood that will wipe out humanity entirely. Enki disagrees, but he's bound by divine oath not to reveal the plan directly. So he cheats the oath by being clever. Depending on the version, he speaks to a wall, or to the reed walls of Atrahasis' house, loudly enough that Atrahasis overhears. It's a divine loophole. The message is clear. Demolish your house, build a boat. Give up your possessions, save your life. Take seed of all living things. Make the boat roofed over, like the Apsu, the underground freshwater ocean the Mesopotamians imagined beneath the earth. The boat in Atrahasis isn't a sleek ship. Later texts describe it as a huge, box-like structure, sometimes even a perfect cube in its dimensions, sealed with pitch, built to ride out chaos rather than cut through waves. Atrahasis loads it with his family and with animals, the seeds of life. The flood comes, the gods unleash storms and waters. Even they are terrified by the scale of what they've done. When the boat finally grounds on some distant highland, Atrahasis opens it and offers a sacrifice. This moment becomes one of the most distinctive motifs in Mesopotamian flood lore. The gods, who have been starving without human offerings during the flood, gather like flies around the sacrifice. It's a phrase that turns up again and again. The flood hasn't just punished humanity, it has also cut off the gods' food supply. Out of this comes a compromise. The gods regret the total destruction. They swear oaths not to annihilate humanity like this again, but they still want to keep the population manageable. So they build in permanent limits, mortality, infertility, priestesses who remain childless. A theological explanation for why humans die, why not everyone has children, and why the world doesn't drown every time things get noisy. A few centuries later, scribes in the same culture zone would reshape this story into the version most people hear about, the flood episode in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is a much larger work, stitched together over centuries, about a king searching for immortality. The flood appears relatively late in the poem as a story within the story. Gilgamesh, grieving the death of his friend Enkidu and terrified of his own mortality, goes on a quest to find Utnapishtim, the one human who has been granted eternal life. When he finally reaches him in a faraway land, Utnapishtim explains why he, alone among mortals, lives forever. And to explain that, he tells the flood story. Here, Atrahasis has effectively been renamed. Utnapishtim fills the same role, wise, warned in advance, builder of a huge boat with exact measurements, sealed with pitch, loaded with animals, family and craftspeople. The gods again decide to erase humanity, again swear each other to secrecy, and again Enki, now often called Ea, circumvents the restriction by speaking to the reed wall of Utnapishtim's house. The boat in Gilgamesh is described in obsessive detail. 7 decks, 9 compartments each, with a total area like a perfect cube. Scribes loved numbers, and those numbers meant something in their symbolic system. This wasn't just an improvised raft, it was a kind of floating city, an ordered miniature cosmos built to survive total disorder. The flood itself is violent and cosmic. The storm gods roar, the daylight turns black. Even the highest gods are frightened and cower like dogs huddled against the wall of heaven. After 7 days, the storm stops. The boat grounds on a mountain. Traditions later identify it with regions like the Zagros Range, far to the north and east of the southern Mesopotamian plains. Utnapishtim, opens a hatch, lets light in, and sends out birds in sequence: a dove, a swallow, and finally a raven. Only when the raven fails to return does he know the waters have receded enough to disembark. This bird test is one of those oddly specific details that will echo later in other traditions. And just like Atrahasis, the first thing he does after landing is light a sacrifice. The gods, starving from the lack of offerings during the flood, swarm around the smoke like flies. They quarrel among themselves. One goddess, Ishtar, wears a lapis lazuli necklace and swears that she will remember this day and never again consent to such total destruction. Enlil, furious that anyone survived, has to be calmed down and ultimately accepts a new arrangement. Utnapishtim and his wife are granted immortality and sent to live at the mouth of the rivers, far from normal human life. Humanity will go on, but with limits. These stories weren't imagined in a vacuum. They come from a land literally built by rivers. The cities of Sumer, Akkad, Assyria, Babylonia, Uruk, Nippur were strung along the Tigris and Euphrates, rivers that could be generous and murderous in the same season. Floods in this region were not gentle, predictable overflows like the idealized annual Nile floods later texts sometimes describe. They could be sudden, violent, and erratic, especially when deforestation and early irrigation works changed how water moved through the landscape. An entire city in low mud brick architecture could be severely damaged by a single bad inundation. Crops gone, grain stores soaked, walls collapsed, cemeteries washed away. In the archaeological layers at sites like Shuruppak and excavators have found thick deposits of riverine silt, sandwiched between normal occupation layers, evidence of severe flooding events that interrupted city life. So, when Mesopotamian scribes told stories about floods that erased almost all humanity, they were writing in a world where water routinely tried to erase the places they lived. The flood was both real and symbolic, both hydrological disaster and theological reset button. Modern scholars argue about what exactly these stories are doing. Some suggest they preserve the cultural memory of one especially devastating regional flood, maybe a superflood that wiped out multiple cities along the rivers at once. Others see Atrahasis and Gilgamesh primarily as literary theology, thoughtful attempts to explain why humans suffer, why the gods seem inconsistent, why mortality and population limits exist. There's also a political reading. These texts were copied in royal courts and temple schools. A story where the gods punish noisy, overabundant humanity, but spare a wise, obedient hero who follows instructions perfectly fits with an ideology that values order, piety, and obedience to higher authority. When a king claims to maintain justice and balance, so the gods don't become angry again, he's positioning himself as the thin line between civilization and another flood. It doesn't have to be only one of these. A real flood can generate trauma. Trauma becomes story. Story becomes theology and political message. By the time we meet Atrahasis and Utnapishtim in baked clay, all of those layers may already be fused together. What matters for our journey tonight is that Mesopotamia gives us a full set of the building blocks we talked about earlier, in written form centuries before similar constellations appear elsewhere. Divine decision, secret warning, boat with exact dimensions, animals and seeds of life, mountain landing, sacrifice, divine regret and a new arrangement. From here, it becomes much easier to see how later traditions, especially in the ancient Near East, might be borrowing, adapting, arguing with, or reinterpreting this Mesopotamian core. And the most famous of those reworkings is the one many people know best, even if they've never heard of Atrahasis or Utnapishtim at all. The story of Noah. When the Hebrew Bible tells the story of Noah, it's speaking into that same flood-shaped landscape, but it's doing something very different with it. In Genesis, the flood begins not with the gods being hungry or sleepless, but with a moral diagnosis. The earth was filled with violence. Human wickedness is great. Every inclination of the human heart is described as only evil continually. It's not noise that bothers God, it's ethics. The decision to destroy the world is framed as grief, not inconvenience. God regrets making humanity, is grieved to his heart. This is not a council of quarrelling deities. This is a single, sovereign creator who looks at the human experiment and decides it has gone catastrophically wrong. Into that decision steps Noah. Like Atrahasis and Utnapishtim, he's the one man singled out. He's described as righteous, blameless in his generation, someone who walks with God. There's no trickster God whispering through a reed wall. God speaks directly. Build an ark. Here too we get exact measurements. The ark is a huge rectangular barge, 3 decks, coated with pitch inside and out, built of gopher wood, a term we don't fully understand but which signals a specific technical tradition. Noah is told to bring his family, pairs of animals, later differentiated into 7 pairs of clean animals and single pairs of unclean. Life is being sorted, categorized, curated for survival. The flood comes as a deliberate unmaking of creation. The fountains of the great deep burst, the windows of heaven open. In the poetic logic of Genesis, this is creation running backwards. Back in chapter 1, God had separated the waters above from the waters below, carved out a habitable space in between, and populated it with life. Now those boundaries fail. The cosmos collapses back into primeval ocean. For 40 days rain falls, waters rise. Everything with the breath of life in its nostrils dies, except what's inside the ark. The language is totalizing and absolute, as befits a world-scale moral reset. Then, as in Gilgamesh, the water begins to subside. Noah's Ark comes to rest on the mountains of Ararat, a term that, in its original context, likely meant a broader kingdom in the Armenian highlands, rather than a single modern volcano. Noah sends out a raven, then a dove. The first dove returns, the second comes back with a freshly plucked olive leaf. The third does not return at all. Only then does Noah open up the ark. He builds an altar, offers sacrifices of the clean animals. The text says the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, almost word for word echoing the Mesopotamian scene where the gods gather like flies around Utnapishtim's offering. But now the theological logic has shifted. God responds not as a starving deity craving food, but as a judge making a new legal decision. Never again will I curse the ground because of humans. Never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done. This is where Genesis adds something new to the flood toolkit: covenant. Instead of a vague agreement among quarrelling gods, we get a formal, structured promise. God binds himself. The cycles of seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will not cease. Human violence remains a problem, but the solution will not be another universal flood. The covenant has terms. Humans are allowed to eat meat, but must not consume blood, a way of acknowledging life as belonging to God. There's a prohibition on murder. Human life is declared to be in the image of God, and shedding it will be accounted for. After a story of limitless violence, limits are the new architecture. The bow in the clouds becomes the sign. In ancient Near Eastern iconography, a bow is a weapon. Genesis imagines God hanging his bow in the sky, pointed away from the earth. A cosmic disarmament symbol. Every rainbow is framed as God remembering his promise, not because he forgets, but because the text wants you to see regular weather as woven into a moral universe. So, how do we get from Atrahasis to Noah? Historians and biblical scholars generally see strong family resemblance here, and they don't think it's accidental. The Hebrew Bible takes shape over many centuries, but the flood story as we have it almost certainly passed through the hands of scribes living in or after the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE. Those scribes were surrounded by Mesopotamian literature. They could read cuneiform. They lived in cities where tablets of Atrahasis and Gilgamesh were copied. Most scholars accept that the Genesis flood narrative is, at minimum, in conversation with Mesopotamian traditions. The shared motifs, divine decision, chosen hero, boat dimensions, animals, mountain landing, birds, sacrifice, divine promise, are simply too specific to brush off as coincidence. But exactly what kind of conversation this is remains debated. One view sees straightforward borrowing. Judean scribes heard or read older flood epics and reshaped them to fit Israel's monotheistic theology and ethical concerns. Another emphasizes shared cultural stock. In a region crisscrossed by trade, war, and migration, flood stories were common currency. Genesis might draw on oral and local versions we no longer have, rather than directly translating any one tablet. There's also discussion about layers within Genesis itself. Some scholars see traces of two slightly different flood traditions woven together. One more focused on precise timelines and animals in pairs, another on sevens and sacrificial logic. Both, though, are using the Mesopotamian toolkit to build a distinctively Israelite argument about God and humans. What almost everyone agrees on is this. Genesis reframes the flood from a problem of noisy overpopulation to a problem of moral corruption. The gods in Atrahasis are annoyed and overwhelmed. The god of Noah is anguished and angry about injustice. The resolution in Atrahasis is essentially demographic management. People will die sooner. Some won't bear children, so the gods can sleep. The resolution in Genesis is moral and relational. There will be law, there will be covenant, and there will be a hard ceiling on how far divine destruction can go. In that sense, the flood becomes not just a story about why disaster happens, but about the architecture of the world we wake up in. A world where violence is real, judgment is possible, but total annihilation is off the table because a promise has been made. Later ages will keep returning to that architecture. Prophets will invoke Noah's days when warning about social injustice. Early Jewish and Christian writers will argue about what the ark symbolizes. And outside the biblical tradition, other cultures will be building their own moral frameworks into their flood stories. To see how that plays out, we cross the sea again, to a rocky land of earthquakes and restless waters, where another couple survives another world-ending rain, and repopulates the earth by throwing stones over their shoulders. In Greek tradition, the reset begins with a courtroom drama in the sky. Humanity has gone wrong again. Later Greek authors gloss it as hubris, arrogance, cruelty, contempt for the gods and for basic justice. One king, Lycaon, even tries to test Zeus by serving him human flesh at a banquet. It's a ritual violation so extreme it rips the veil off the whole human project. Zeus, unlike the council of Mesopotamian gods or the grieving god of Genesis, responds like a storm system given a moral brain. He decides not just to punish a few bad actors, but to wipe the board. The instrument is familiar. Rain without limit. The skies open. Rivers swell. Seas surge inland. Mountains that once looked safe are swallowed. The Greek world, usually imagined as a patchwork of small valleys and island harbours, becomes one continuous churning sea. Almost everyone dies, almost. Down in Thessaly, Deucalion, son of the Titan Prometheus, gets a warning. In some versions, Prometheus tips him off. In others, Zeus himself relents enough to allow one righteous couple through. Deucalion is described as most just of men, his wife Pyrrha, daughter of Epimetheus and Pandora, as most reverent. They're not perfect, they're paradigmatic. In a corrupt generation, they're the ones who still take justice and piety seriously. Deucalion builds a chest or small ark, loads it with provisions, and climbs aboard with Pyrrha. The flood rises, their little craft is lifted up and carried over a drowned Greece. For 9 days and nights they drift, until at last the waters begin to fall and the box comes to rest on Mount Parnassus, above Delphi. They step out into silence. No flocks, no neighbours, no cities on distant hills, just wet rock, mud, and the echo of retreating water. Like Noah, Deucalion responds with sacrifice. He builds an altar and honours Zeus, not as the destroyer, but as the god who has allowed any future at all. And here the Greek story turns in a very different direction. There is no cargo hold full of animals, no pairs marched carefully down a ramp. Instead, the question hits Deucalion and Pyrrha with simple brutality. If we are the last 2 people on Earth now, what? They decide to seek guidance. They walk to the shrine of Themis, or, in some traditions, to the newly re-emerging oracle of Delphi, the place the Greeks imagined as the navel of the world, the point where divine and human communication is literally vented up from the deep. They pray, asking how to restore the human race without incurring new guilt. They don't want to become the kind of people the flood was sent to erase. The answer that comes back is a riddle. Cover your heads, loosen your garments, and throw behind you the bones of your mother. It's an oracle in the classic Greek mode, opaque, unsettling, technically precise, but morally loaded. Deucalion and Pyrrha argue about it. They refuse to believe the gods are telling them to desecrate their parents' graves. Eventually Deucalion makes the interpretive leap. Our mother is the earth. Her bones are the stones. So they obey. They veil their heads, loosen their clothing, and walk, each tossing stones over a shoulder. As the stones leave their hands, they soften and reshape. The ones thrown by Deucalion become men, the ones thrown by Pyrrha become women. They're described as hard, rugged, fit for toil, a people literally of the earth, but also enduring, not easily washed away. This is one of the strangest repopulation scenes in any major flood myth. There are no pairs of clean and unclean animals, no careful genealogies. There is instead a philosophical joke about what it means to be born of the earth, and a quiet ethical statement. The new humanity will come from obedience to a difficult command and a refusal to commit fresh sacrilege, not from desperation or panic. It also has a geological flavour that's hard to miss if you live in the Aegean. In Greece, you don't need to imagine an abstract, mythic ocean swallowing the world. You can stand on a harbour and see where ancient quays now sit below the waterline. You can hike a hillside and find marine shells in the soil. Earthquakes tilt coastlines. Landslides plunge into bays and send walls of water racing toward low towns. Storms blow in from the Mediterranean and batter the same coves where Bronze Age sailors once moored their ships. A big enough tsunami in a narrow gulf, a storm surge funneled between islands, can make your whole familiar world look like a single roaring sea and leave behind a shoreline littered with stone. The idea that new people might literally come from rocks after the old ones have been swept away has a certain grim environmental logic when your landscape is always crumbling and reforming under your feet. Greek myth doesn't only have one flood either. Local traditions tell of the flood of Ogyges, an even earlier deluge that supposedly left Attica desolate, of a Boeotian flood, of waters that once drowned the Thessalian plain, until a hero cut a channel at Tempe. These are not all versions of the same event. They're multiple reset buttons attached to different regions and genealogies. Each time the pattern recurs, a moral or ritual failure, a divinely sent inundation, a survival on high ground, or in a boat and a new start. Sometimes the focus is on cleansing a particular city's past. Sometimes it's on elevating a local hero who made the land drain or guided the ark. The flood becomes part of how Greek communities explain why their valley used to be a lake, or why their city's founder counts as second humanity. Behind all this sit the trade winds and shipping lanes of the eastern Mediterranean. By the time Greek authors are writing in the classical period, the Aegean is stitched into a dense web of contacts with the Levant, Cyprus, Anatolia, Egypt. Mycenaean Greeks had been sailing and fighting and intermarrying along those coasts centuries earlier. Phoenician merchants later crisscrossed the same waters. Stories travelled with copper ingots and jars of oil. Scholars have long noticed parallels between Deucalion's flood and Near Eastern traditions: the divine decision, the chosen couple, the boat, the mountain landing, the sacrifice, even the focus on a small remnant preserved for a new age. It's hard to imagine that Greek poets and priests, operating in that maritime crossroads, never heard Eastern tales of catastrophic waters. But the Greek version does something very Greek with that material. It folds it into the world of oracles, riddles, and philosophical wordplay. It makes the key moment not just survival, but correct interpretation of a cryptic divine message. It repopulates the earth not by sheer fertility, but by a symbolic act, turning bones of the mother, dead, inert stone, into living people through obedience and insight. In Mesopotamia, the flood solves an administrative headache. In Genesis, it recalibrates a moral universe. In Greece, it becomes a series of local resets, anchored in a landscape of earthquakes and coasts, filtered through the voice of the oracle, and resolved by a pair who manage, in the wake of world-ending water, to read the gods correctly. From here, if we sail east again, we find another survivor on another boat, warned by a fish instead of a titan, navigating not the narrow Aegean, but the vast monsoon-torn waters of South Asia. In South Asia, the warning doesn't come from a trickster titan or a thunder god. It comes from something small, a fish. The story, in its classical form, goes like this. Manu, sometimes described as a king, sometimes as the primordial man, sometimes both at once, is performing his morning ablutions in a river. He dips his hands into the water, and when he lifts them, there is a tiny fish cupped in his palms. The fish speaks. "Protect me," it says, "and I will protect you." It's an odd bargain. Manu could simply toss it back. But he doesn't. He feels pity or curiosity, or an intuition that this is no ordinary creature. He slips the fish into a jar. The next day, the jar is too small. The fish has grown. Manu moves it to a tank. It outgrows the tank. He moves it to a lake. The lake becomes crowded with its size. Finally, he leads it to the sea, and even the sea seems barely adequate. By this point it's obvious. The fish is an avatar of Vishnu, the preserver god, and having tested Manu's willingness to care for a vulnerable stranger, it fulfills its promise. It tells him a flood is coming. Not just a bad monsoon, a deluge that will sweep away land, cities, mountains, everything. Manu is instructed to build a boat. He is told to load it with the seeds of all living things, with the 7 sages who carry the Vedic wisdom, and with the tools and texts needed to rebuild ritual and law. He is told to wait for the waters to rise. When they do, chaos returns. The world dissolves back toward the primordial ocean. But Manu's boat is ready. The great fish appears with a horn on its head. Manu lashes the vessel to that horn with a serpent rope. Matsya, the fish, tows the boat through the heaving waters, navigating the currents of the unmade world. Eventually, when the flood recedes, the boat comes to rest on a mountain top. Manu descends, performs a sacrifice, and from that sacrificial act, new life, new people, and a restored order emerge. Many of the ingredients are familiar by now: the warning, the vessel, the chosen survivor, the mountain landing, the post-flood sacrifice. But the flavour of the story is very different. For one thing, this is not a one-time cosmic accident. In the Hindu cosmological frame, worlds come and go in vast cycles, ages of creation, preservation and dissolution, stretching over unimaginable spans of time. A flood that wipes away a world is not the end of everything. It is part of the breathing rhythm of the universe. The Manu story is attached to one of these dissolutions, a pralaya, and to the beginning of a new cycle. So when Vishnu as fish warns Manu, he's not just saving a remnant from an unexpected catastrophe. He's managing a scheduled reset. What must be preserved, then, is not only biological life, but dharma, the pattern of right action, duty and ritual that keeps the cosmos running smoothly. That's why the boat holds sages and scriptures, as well as seeds and animals. When Manu steps out onto drying earth, his job is not simply to repopulate. It's to re-establish law, sacrifice, and social order so that this new age doesn't collapse back into chaos. Preservation of law and meaning sits right beside preservation of bodies. Over the centuries, Indian texts tell this story in slightly different ways. In the Shatapatha Brahmana, an early prose ritual text, the tale has a more spare mythic tone. In the Mahabharata, the great epic, the narrative is richer, woven into other cycles of war and dharma. In the Puranas, composed and compiled over many centuries, Matsya becomes one of Vishnu's 10 main avatars, and the flood is clearly tied to cosmic cycles. Each layer retains the core, the fish, the warning, the boat, Manu, as first man of a new world. But each layer also shifts emphasis, sometimes more on ritual details, sometimes on cosmic time, sometimes on Vishnu's compassion. The story behaves the way oral traditions usually do over long stretches of time. It crystallizes around a few durable images, while commentary and context keep accreting. Behind that long literary evolution is a very specific landscape. The Indian subcontinent is, and always has been, a river civilization. The Indus, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, the Godavari, the Krishna, the Narmada. These are rivers that flood, shift course, and periodically erase entire human layouts. Archaeologists working on the ruins of the Indus Valley cities see evidence of repeated water damage, silt layers, changing river channels. Later, along the Ganges plain, dense agricultural societies lived at the mercy of monsoon failures and monsoon excesses. A late or absent monsoon could mean drought and famine. An overcharged one could turn rivers into wide, moving sheets of brown water, drowning villages, floating cattle, uprooting trees. If you live with that generation after generation, it's not hard to imagine how the river that rose too high becomes the world that was drowned, and how stories about exceptional floods might expand, in a culture that already thinks in cycles of creation and destruction, into stories about the end and rebirth of entire cosmic ages. Still, the Manu narrative is not just a weather report. The tiny fish that needs protection then reveals cosmic knowledge, carries an ethical twist. The one who takes responsibility for a weak, unnoticed life is the one entrusted with the survival of all life. The test is not a secret blueprint or an engineering challenge. It's whether Manu will care. That's a very different emphasis from stories where the survivor is chosen purely for ritual piety or where the gods unilaterally pick a favourite. Here, reciprocity matters. Manu protects the fish protects Manu. Dharma, in that sense, is mutual obligation even across species, even across scales of being. From a comparative angle, the parallels are striking. We still have a forewarned human, a looming flood, a boat or ark, a select cargo, the grounding on a height, the post-flood offering. No exotic special effects are needed to explain why these motifs show up in India, as well as in Mesopotamia or the Mediterranean. Large riverine civilizations, seasonal extremes, and the psychological impact of seeing your entire horizon turn to water can push story makers in very similar directions. Whether Indian storytellers were influenced by Near Eastern traditions, or whether similar experiences simply generated analogous myths, is debated. Trade connections between Mesopotamia and the Indus are as old as the Bronze Age. Cultural contact is entirely plausible. So is independent development in a culture whose own cosmology, with its cycles and incarnations, gives the flood a distinctly different meaning. In South Asia, the Great Deluge is not only a punishment or a clean-up operation, it is a scheduled transition between ages. Manu is not just a lucky survivor. He is the prototype lawgiver of a new cycle, the one who reloads the world with both genomes and guidelines. When the waters fall, what matters most is not that some people are left alive, but that someone remembers how to realign human life with the grain of the universe. If we keep moving east and a little north, another tradition will take that same sense of overwhelming water and attach it to the founding of an entire dynasty and to the engineering genius of a single tireless man. In early Chinese memory, the Great Flood doesn't come with a talking fish or a god in disguise. It comes as a problem, an enormous, grinding, never-quite-ending problem. In the oldest layers of the tradition, the flood isn't a single dramatic wave that surges in, wrecks everything, and drains away. It's more like a long catastrophe. For years, maybe for generations, waters rise and stay risen. Rivers overflow their banks, lakes swell and merge. Lowlands turn into marshes that never really dry out. The world doesn't end, it just stops working properly. People can't plant, paths vanish, settlements are forced onto hills and scattered high ground. Hunters and farmers become refugees. It isn't apocalyptic in the sense of everything dies at once. It's apocalyptic in the sense of nothing is stable anymore. In this landscape of soggy chaos, later texts introduce a figure whose job is not to survive the flood, but to fix it. Yu, sometimes called Yu the Great, he appears in sources like the Classic of Documents, the Bamboo Annals, and later the records of the Grand Historian. The details shift with time, but the core is remarkably consistent. Yu does not build a boat, he builds drainage. The story usually starts with failure. Before Yu, there's his father Gun, charged by the legendary sage King Yao to control the waters. Gun's strategy is to block, to dam, to pile up embankments and barriers to hold the flood back. It doesn't work. In some versions, his earthworks are washed away. In others, the gods punish him for stealing a magical self-growing soil. Either way, the result is the same. The waters keep spreading, and Gun is disgraced or executed. Enter Yu, appointed by the next sage king Shun to try again. Yu looks at what his father did and chooses the opposite strategy. Instead of trying to stop the water, he studies it. He spends years travelling the land, observing where rivers run, where they overflow, where they could be channeled. He organises labour. He cuts channels, dredges riverbeds, opens spillways to the sea. He deepens some courses, diverts others, and uses the natural slopes of the land instead of fighting them. In later retellings, he is tireless to the point of being superhuman. He passes his own home 3 times while overseeing the works, and each time refuses to go in because stopping even briefly might delay the relief people need. He wades through mud, sleeps outdoors, wears himself down in the service of something larger. This isn't an arc story, it's an engineering story. And just beneath the engineering, it's a political story. In the Chinese tradition, Yu's achievement doesn't just save scattered survivors. It makes the land governable again. Once the waters are channeled and the plains dry, fields can be measured, crops can be taxed, roads and irrigation can be laid out in a rational grid. The very same texts that praise Yu's flood work also credit him with dividing the world into regions, standardizing measures and establishing patterns of tribute. Order over water becomes order over people. That's where the mandate of heaven begins to slip into the narrative. Later philosophers and historians look back on this semi-mythic time and see a lesson. Legitimate rule in China is tied to the ruler's ability to manage water. Heaven, in this view, doesn't speak through prophetic dreams or animal messengers. It speaks through climate and hydrology. If the king is virtuous and competent, rivers stay within their banks, rains come in the right amount, crops grow. If he is corrupt or inept, disasters multiply, floods, droughts, locusts, earthquakes. Rebellion in that framework isn't just politics. It's heaven withdrawing its mandate. Yu is cast as the model of someone who earns that mandate. He doesn't inherit his position in a simple father-to-son line from Yao or Shun. He proves himself through practical action, then is yielded to, chosen. That narrative in turn is used to justify the start of the Ji, the first traditional dynasty. Yu's son succeeds him, and now hereditary rule looks acceptable because it began with a man who literally carved civilization out of chaos. Compared to Mesopotamian or biblical flood stories, the contrast is sharp. There is no single ark full of animals, no one mountain where the boat comes to rest, no post-flood sacrifice that reboots the cosmos. The gods or heaven are not trying to erase humanity. They are allowing, or perhaps sending, a disaster that reveals who can impose lasting order. The solution isn't withdrawal from the world on a floating refuge. It's immersion in it, surveying, measuring, organising, reallocating labour, making channels where there were none. From a historian's perspective, the Yu story sits in an interesting place between legend and possible memory. Chinese archaeologists and geologists have long debated whether there was a real great flood behind the myth. One prominent proposal points to evidence of a massive landslide on the upper Yellow River around 1900 BCE that may have created a temporary dam, then failed catastrophically, sending a huge surge downstream. Some researchers have suggested this could match later memories of an unusually destructive flood, perhaps coinciding with political upheaval in early Bronze Age China. Others caution that the textual record for Yu and the Xia dynasty solidifies much later, in the first millennium BCE. By then, long traditions of seasonal flooding on rivers like the Yellow and the Yangtze, combined with the political need for ancient precedents, could have shaped and amplified older local stories into one grand foundational narrative. What most scholars do agree on is that these were river systems capable of repeated devastating floods. Yellow River sediments, historical chronicles from later dynasties, and the sheer engineering effort poured into dikes and canals all testify to a landscape where water constantly threatened to undo human work. In that context, it makes sense that the archetypal hero is not a passenger on a rescue vessel, but the organizer of a water control project. Flood, in this Chinese frame, becomes the test case for everything that follows. If you can take a landscape where water is everywhere it shouldn't be, swamps where there should be fields, torrents where there should be roads, and turn it into a stable grid of arable land and predictable channels, you have done more than solve a disaster. You've created the basic template of civilization, boundaries, routes, jurisdictions, systems that hold even when individuals die. Yu's channels inscribe law into geography. His embankments are policy in packed earth. Later rulers will be judged in part by whether they maintain and improve those systems. When dikes fail and famines spread, Critics will say the ruler has lost Yu's way, and therefore heaven's approval. The memory of the Great Flood, and the man who tamed it, becomes a permanent blueprint for what good government is supposed to look like. Across the world, floods keep wiping the slate clean. In China, the story turns that same overwhelming water into a measuring stick. Not just of human endurance, but of human organisation, of who can turn chaos into channels, and channels into a world where people can plant, build, and believe that the ground under their feet will still be there next year. Further south and east in island worlds where there is almost nothing but water, stories will take that same anxiety and rework it again, this time around boats, mountains, and the thin lines of land that always feel one storm away from disappearing. In Southeast Asia, and across the vast blue of the Pacific, the flood almost never arrives as a single river gone mad. It comes from everywhere at once, from the horizon where a typhoon pushes the ocean up into a living wall, from the sky when rain falls so hard it feels like the air has turned to water, from below when a volcano shakes an island, drops part of it into the sea, and the displaced water comes roaring back. If you live on a river plain in Mesopotamia, a flood is something that escapes its proper bounds. If you live on a low coral atoll, the ocean doesn't have bounds. It's everything around you. The flood is what happens when that thin strip of safety proves negotiable. So it's not surprising that, from Indonesia to Polynesia, flood stories turn again and again to two ideas: boats and high ground. In many Austronesian traditions, people survive the Great Water not in a massive ark, but in canoes. Sometimes one canoe, sometimes a small fleet, sometimes it's a log hollowed out in a hurry, sometimes a carefully built vessel that was already there, waiting. The Timorese tell of a time when the sea rose up and only those who escaped in boats survived. In parts of the Philippines, stories speak of torrential rains and a world drowned, with a brother and sister saved because they climbed into a bamboo vessel or found refuge on a drifting log. In island Southeast Asia, it's common for a mountain peak or a single tall tree on a mountain to become the place where the last humans cling while the waters cover everything else. In Polynesia too, you hear of great inundations, of canoes lashed together, of people steering toward the one island or summit that still stands above the waves. Sometimes a culture hero like Maui raises new land out of the sea after a deluge. Sometimes gods or ancestral spirits warn a favoured family to build a large canoe before the waters rise, or to sail toward a particular star before a storm comes. Refuge by canoe, refuge by mountain. The landscape explains a lot of this. Much of maritime Southeast Asia is a tangle of islands threaded by monsoon winds and storm tracks. Coastlines are not stable lines on a map, they're suggestions. Mangrove swamps expand and retreat, deltas shift, rivers change course. A single typhoon can push salt water deep inland, flood rice fields, tear houses off their piles, and redraw the memory of where land ends and sea begins. Further east in Melanesia and Polynesia, entire worlds ride low on the ocean's surface. Coral atolls barely rise a few meters above sea level. Volcanic islands grow by eruption and shrink by collapse. A tsunami here doesn't just damage a port or a city. It sweeps clear across a whole island. There are places where, if the sea level rose by just a couple of meters, the main village site would disappear entirely. In that setting, you don't need a single once-in-all-of-history flood to build a tradition. You just need one bad generation every so often, one super typhoon that pushes waves far beyond what elders remember, one undersea earthquake that sends a wall of water smashing against every shore in sight. One volcanic eruption that collapses a flank of mountain into the sea and sends a local mega-tsunami around the neighbouring islands. Those events don't have to be globally apocalyptic to feel like the end of the world when you're 8 years old and watching your entire village vanish. People survive. They rebuild, maybe a little higher up, maybe with stronger lashings on the houses, maybe with a new story about the time when the waters tried to take everything. Now add something else that's unique about this region: mobility. The Austronesian expansion, the spread of related languages and cultures from Taiwan down through the Philippines and Indonesia, out to Madagascar in the west, and all the way to Hawaii and Easter Island in the east, is one of the most extraordinary human migrations in history. These were people whose default state was seafaring. They understood currents and winds deeply enough to cross hundreds, then thousands of kilometres of open water in double-hulled canoes and outrigger vessels. They carried crops, animals, tools, and stories. When you sail from island to island, storms are not abstract. You see squall lines. You ride out nights when the sky vanishes and waves come from directions that don't match the wind. You learn quickly that survival often depends on knowing when to leave the shore and when to flee to it. It's easy to imagine how over generations tales of the big storm, the high water, the island that went under could travel along those same routes. A disaster that happened in one cluster of islands might be retold, adjusted, and folded into local traditions in another, then a third. Details shift: which god gave the warning, which peak stayed dry, what shape the canoe took, but the spine of the story remains. The water rose. Almost everything was lost. A small group in a boat or on a mountain survived and became the ancestors of us. From a historian's perspective, though, there's a problem. Most of these traditions were recorded late by outsiders. Missionaries, colonial administrators, ethnographers collecting oral histories in the 19th and 20th centuries wrote down what people told them, stories that had already been reshaped by local politics, by the trauma of contact, by Christian flood narratives carried in Bibles and sermons. It's difficult to sort out which motifs are genuinely ancient, which spread organically along indigenous trade routes, and which were encouraged or reinterpreted after the arrival of Europeans who came with their own Noah. Even within a single island group, oral versions can differ dramatically. Some emphasize moral failure. The people were arrogant, incestuous, cannibalistic, and the flood came as punishment. Others are almost purely naturalistic. The sea rose, the land sank, no explicit moral reason given. That variety is exactly what you'd expect if multiple different local disasters over many centuries were repeatedly folded into one flexible template of the big water. So interpretations here have to be cautious. When we notice that a Polynesian tale features a family warned in advance, a boat, animals saved, and a mountaintop, it's tempting to draw a straight line to Mesopotamia or the Bible. But the lived environment of these communities already pushes in that direction. If your world is islands, your lifeline is a canoe. If your horizon is water, the only possible sanctuary is height. A pattern of stories where people escape rising seas by boat or by retreating to peaks doesn't require a single ancient myth diffusing from somewhere else. It could emerge, and probably did emerge, independently in dozens of places, then get strengthened, blended, and sometimes more recently coloured by imported religious ideas. What these island and coastal traditions add to the global picture is a different flavour of the same underlying anxiety. In Mesopotamia, the fear is that the river gods might overflow their banks and erase the fields. In China, the fear is that the waters might never quite recede enough for life to organise again. In Southeast Asia and Oceania, the fear is that the thin line between sea and land, the beach, the reef, the low plain, is not as solid as it looks, that tomorrow's storm might draw it somewhere else. Over generations, local storms and surges, tsunamis and collapses, keep rehearsing that lesson. and the stories, carried in canoes along with pigs and taro and obsidian, turn memory into map. Here is where the water once came. Here is how our ancestors survived. Here is the mountain, or the boat, or the god that kept just enough of us alive to start the world again. Cross the Pacific, keep going east, and you hit another pair of worlds where the flood refuses to stay put. The high civilizations of Mesoamerica and the Andes. Here, the water isn't just an accident of weather. It's part of the schedule. In many of these traditions, the cosmos doesn't run once from creation to the end. It runs in cycles. Worlds are made, populated, ruined, and restarted. And a flood is one of the favourite ways to sweep the board. Take central Mexico. In later Aztec accounts, the gods have already gone through several attempts at making humans. Each sun, each world age, ends in catastrophe, one in jaguars, one in wind, one in fire from the sky, and one in water. In that watery destruction, rain falls without stopping, the sky tips over, and humans are turned into fish. Only a man and a woman survive in a hollowed-out log or a little boat, warned by a god to take refuge before the waters rise. After the flood, they land on a mountain and begin to grind maize to make offerings. The gods, annoyed or threatened by their noise, sometimes transform them into dogs. The details shift from version to version, and some of those versions are late and obviously touched by Christian storytelling. But the pattern is clear. Water arrives not just as a physical disaster, but as a reset button. A way for the gods to admit that attempt at humanity didn't work. Let's try again. Further south among Maya traditions, you get something similar, but with a different emotional tone. In the Quiché Maya Popol Vuh, which was written down in the 16th century but preserves much older material, the gods are trying to make beings who can speak and remember them properly. They start with animals. That doesn't work. They try humans made of mud. Those collapse. They try wooden people who move and talk but have no hearts and no gratitude. So the gods destroy this wooden generation. How? With a mixture of calamities. A rain of resin, attacks by their own tools and pots and grinding stones, and finally a flood. The survivors are scattered, transformed into monkeys. Only later, when humans are made out of maize dough, does the project succeed. Again, a flood is there at the moment of correction. Not necessarily because people were sinful in a biblical sense, but because they were incomplete, unfit for the moral and ritual order the gods want. Water is a solvent for failed prototypes. On the other side of the equator, high in the Andes, the pattern changes, but the themes echo. In some Quechua and Aymara stories recorded after the Spanish conquest, the creator deity, often called Viracocha, decides that an early race of giants or disobedient people must go. He unleashes a flood that drowns almost everyone. A few survive in caves or in the hollow trunk of a tree or high on a mountain that the water never quite reaches. When the waters recede, Viracocha travels through the emptied landscape, turning some of the old beings into stone, shaping new peoples out of clay, assigning each group its home valley, its language, its duties. The flood clears the stage so a more ordered, more hierarchical world can be built. Here, too, the catastrophe isn't random. It's tied to behaviour, arrogance, violence, neglect of ritual. Not always in the same way European moralists would frame it, but still an ethical commentary. Floods arrive when people and gods fall out of alignment. All of this is happening in regions that, for tens of thousands of years, had no contact with Mesopotamia, the Mediterranean, or the Bible. The first humans into the Americas probably crossed from Siberia toward the end of the last ice age, and if there was any trickle of contact across the Pacific later, we have, at best, very thin and controversial hints. By the time Aztec priests or Andean storytellers were talking about world ages washed clean by deluges, their societies had been developing independently of Eurasia for an extremely long time. So when we see patterns here, survivors in a vessel, mountaintop refuges, gods remaking humans, it's hard to explain them purely by borrowed stories. Cultural diffusion across Beringia 30,000 years ago is possible, but it would have to preserve very specific motifs for an implausibly long time without any of the intermediate evidence we might expect. It's usually simpler to look first at the landscapes themselves. Mesoamerica is a theatre of intense rainy seasons. In some regions, months of drought are followed by weeks where the sky seems to open a valve and forget to close it. Tropical storms pile up along the coasts. Rivers in narrow valleys can rise shockingly fast, turning brown and violent, ripping terraces from hillsides, carrying houses away at night. Landslides are a constant threat in steep, saturated terrain. A hillside collapsing into a river can create a local dam, and when that fragile barrier gives way, you don't just get a high river, you get a sudden surge that behaves to everyone downstream, like a wall of water that came from nowhere. In the Andes, water is even more obviously tied to cosmic drama. Glaciers feed rivers that plunge thousands of meters toward the Pacific or the Amazon. During strong El Niño events, warm Pacific waters shift rainfall patterns, bringing punishing rains to normally dry coastal deserts. Archaeological evidence suggests that some ancient Andean societies really were hammered, repeatedly, by these oscillations. Fields buried by mudflows, irrigation canals shredded, coastal settlements wiped out by flash floods, coming down from the mountains. Add in glacial meltwater lakes perched behind natural ice or rock dams. When those fail, as they sometimes do, you get sudden catastrophic outburst floods racing down narrow valleys. People who see that once do not forget it. People who hear about it fold it into their sense of what the world can do when it decides to turn over. In that setting, the idea of a god draining the sky, of water erasing whole generations and then pulling back to reveal a clean slate, doesn't feel exotic. It feels like an amplification of familiar risks. But historians and anthropologists working with these American flood stories face an extra problem. The record is broken. By the time most Mesoamerican and Andean myths were written down, Spanish conquest and missionary campaigns had already torn apart the societies that told them. Scribes trained by friars wrote in Latin letters, sometimes consciously weaving indigenous and Christian elements together, sometimes trimming details that sounded pagan, sometimes unconsciously hearing echoes of Noah in stories that had once stood on their own. The Popol Vuh itself survives, because Maya nobles copied it into alphabetic script decades after their hieroglyphic books were burned. The Andean chronicles we have were dictated in Quechua or Aymara to Spanish-speaking writers with their own expectations about what a flood story should look like. Earlier versions carved in stone or painted on bark, or simply passed along by oral specialists whose lineages were disrupted, are gone. So interpretation has to be careful. When an Andean tale mentions a man and woman riding out a deluge in a container that sounds suspiciously like an ark, is that a pre-Columbian motif or a post-contact rephrasing? When an Aztec priest describes previous world ages ending in elements, jaguar, wind, fire, water, is that an old Nahua scheme, or has the Christian sequence of punishments reshaped it? Scholars disagree, and probably always will, on some of those details. What seems solid, though, is the broader pattern. Long before Europeans arrived, American civilizations were already thinking in terms of periodic world renewals. They already saw floods not just as scary weather, but as tools in the hands of gods who could scrap one version of humanity and try another. They already linked water with ethics, gratitude, proper ritual, the danger of forgetting your place in the order of things. In these traditions, the Great Flood isn't a one-time mistake the gods swear never to repeat. It's one move among several in a recurring cosmic cycle, and that sets up a different kind of anxiety. Not will there be another flood, but when this age ends, and it will, what will we become? Fish again, monkeys, stones on a hillside that once used to walk. The water, in other words, is not just behind us in a single ancient disaster. It's waiting ahead as one of several possible endings. And in the next part of our journey, moving north across the continent, we'll find that even in societies without pyramids or empires, that sense of water as judge and teacher runs deep, etched into stories told around fires, on plains, in forests, and along the long, braided rivers of North America. Move north, and the architecture changes. No stepped pyramids dominating lake basins. No stone roads running over mountain passes. Instead, a mosaic of villages and camps, horticultural fields and hunting grounds, forests and plains and coasts. Hundreds of distinct nations, speaking hundreds of languages, each with its own territory, its own spirits, its own way of telling what the world once did. And threaded through many of those traditions, again, is water that rises too high. You see familiar outlines: a flood that cleanses, a few survivors, a world remade. But the shape of the story bends to the land, along the Pacific Northwest, among coasts Salish, Tlingit, Haida, and others. There are tales of a time when the ocean climbed the mountains. People lash their canoes to the tops of tall trees or peaks, or they carve deep fastening holes in rock so their lines won't slip. The waters rise, the land disappears, and for days or weeks the survivors float, sometimes sustained by whatever food they manage to pack, sometimes by help from animal beings who bring them fish or show them where driftwood and seaweed can be gathered. When the waters finally fall, the canoes come to rest on new shores. People climb down into a reconfigured world. Rivers have shifted. Beaches are in different places. It's not a cosmic reset so much as a local one, a rearranged coastline, a reminder that the sea which feeds you can also move your village like a toy. In the interior plains among nations like the Blackfoot or Cree, some stories shift the focus to rivers that leave their banks or to an earlier age when the land itself had not yet fully emerged. In several Algonquian-speaking traditions, the earth diver motif appears. A great flood covers everything, and a culture hero, often called Nanabozo or something similar, floats on a log with various animals. The hero sends them down into the depths to fetch a bit of mud. One by one, they fail. The loon, the otter, the beaver dive and come back gasping. Finally, a small, easily underestimated creature, often a muskrat, dives, stays gone so long the others think it has died, and surfaces at last with a pinch of earth clutched in its paws. From that tiny scrap, the creator or the hero spreads and blows and sings a new land into being. Here the Ark is not a cargo ship carrying every species 2 by 2. It's a small raft or a log, a precarious platform shared between human and animal persons. The logistics are different, but the function is similar, a narrative machine for preserving continuity through catastrophe. The difference is that the animals are not just passengers. They're partners. They rescue humans as much as humans rescue them. That theme runs strong in northern stories too. Among some Inuit and Dene groups, there are tales of water rising over tundra and low hills, of people surviving on high ground or in boats, guided by birds who know where the land will reappear, warned by beings in dreams to move before the river ice breaks in an unusual way. The ethics wrapped around these stories are about attention and respect. Listen to the animals, listen to the land, and you might have time to get to safety. Across this huge region, the moral is rarely, "You were wicked, so the flood came." It's more often, You forgot how to live properly with others, with animals, with neighbouring bands, with the river itself, and the world reminded you that you're not in charge. The specificity matters. North American indigenous flood stories don't usually talk about all humanity being wiped out in the abstract. They talk about this valley, this bay, this bend in the river. They remember an island that vanished, a fishing ground that turned to open water, a prairie lowland that filled and became a lake. The survivors are not universal ancestors, but very particular ones, the grandparents of this clan, the founders of that village. Anthropologists and indigenous knowledge keepers have pointed out that some of these stories map uncannily onto real places. On the northwest coast, you get tales of villages drowned when the sea suddenly rose and then stayed high, something that could match post-glacial sea level rise, or even local tsunamis from earthquakes along the Cascadia subduction zone. In glaciated regions you hear of ice dams breaking, of walls of water roaring down valleys where modern geology does, in fact, find signs of old flood scouring. Does that mean every flood story is a literal eyewitness account of a specific event? Probably not. Oral tradition is not a seismograph. It's a weaving of memory, value, and cosmology. But it is remarkably good at preserving patterns. This place can drown. This behaviour angers the powers here. If you ignore the warning signs, you won't have time to run. Embedded in tales of muskrats and canoes are practical lessons about where to build, what to watch in the sky and river, how to think about risk. And crucially, none of this is one homogeneous Native American flood myth. The story told by a Tlingit elder on the Alaska coast is not the same as one told by a Choctaw storyteller by a southeastern river, or a Hopi elder in the arid southwest, recounting how earlier worlds ended in floods and were survived in sealed reeds or underground refuges. The languages, the gods or culture heroes, the narrative logic all differ. What they share in many cases is the sense that water is not just background weather. It is a moral agent. It responds to imbalance. It works with animals and spirits to correct, to teach, to humble. And survival is not guaranteed by technology alone, by having the biggest boat or the tallest hill, but by being in right relationship with your community, with non-human helpers, with the land that will have to be remade after the waters draw back. Those are themes that will follow us as we turn to yet another continent and another set of flood memories shaped by different rivers and different histories, but haunted by the same question: what happens when the water decides it's time to start over? Shift again, and the map changes shape in your mind. Instead of a patchwork of small lakes and forest rivers, you're looking at continent-scale waters, a single green ribbon running through desert for thousands of kilometres, inland seas, linked by channels and marsh, rainy seasons that turn dry riverbeds into rushing brown walls of water, and then vanish again. And, as before, people whose stories grew up along those waters do not all tell the same one. Take the Nile for ancient Egyptians. Its yearly flood was not a freak disaster, but the pulse of the world. When the river rose in summer and spilled into its floodplain, it left behind black silt that made agriculture possible. Too low a flood meant famine, too high, and villages and fields washed away. The line between blessing and destruction was a few cubits on a stone gauge. Egyptian texts don't usually talk about a single, once and for all deluge drowning everything. They talk about cycles, the creator god Atum emerging from primeval water, the land rising from the none, the gods occasionally threatening to return the world to that formless flood if humans misbehave. In some versions of the myth of the goddess Sekhmet, when she goes on a rampage and humanity faces annihilation, the gods pour out beer dyed red like blood that floods the land. She drinks, passes out, and the destruction stops. It's not a neat arc story, but the logic is familiar. Too much divine anger turns the land back toward water. Mercy arrives as a controlled symbolic flood that prevents a total reset. Move west into the Sahel and Savannah, and the tone shifts again. Among some Mande-speaking peoples of West Africa, there are tales of earlier ages ended by water, of chieftains or entire towns wiped out because they broke oaths, mistreated strangers, or disrespected spirits tied to rivers and wells. In several traditions, a river that normally behaves, flowing in its channel, watering fields, suddenly overflows and doesn't go back, swallowing compounds and fields. The survivors escaped to higher ground and found new settlements with new rules. Don't hoard grain, don't lie in oaths sworn by the river, treat guests well. Here, the flood is not just weather, it's a verdict. Around Africa's Great Lakes, the vast inland seas of East Africa, you find still different emphases. In parts of what is now Uganda, Rwanda, and Tanzania, there are stories of lakes that were once valleys until people offended a lake spirit or failed to share resources. Springs gushed or a river changed course, and the basin filled, burying homes and gardens. Islands and hilltops became refuges, the seed of new kingdoms. The message is often about social order, greed, failure of hospitality, or the arrogance of a ruler can literally sink a community. Further south, along the Zambezi, Limpopo, and other big rivers, oral histories sometimes remember years of great water when floodplains that normally rise and fall on a seasonal rhythm instead stayed underwater, forcing whole villages to move. There are Shona and Juni stories where a deity or powerful ancestor sends that abnormal flood because people have forgotten ritual obligations. Survival depends on those who still remember the right songs or offerings, who can persuade the river to withdraw. When it does, people plant again, but with stricter taboos and renewed shrines. The world is not erased, but it is morally reset. None of these narratives float in isolation. For thousands of years, Africa's major waters have been trade corridors as much as ecosystems. Canoes and ships moved along the Nile, across Lake Victoria, down the Niger and Congo, carrying salt, gold, grain, people, and stories. Islamic expansion layered Quranic flood narratives centered on Nu onto older local traditions from the Sahel to the Swahili coast. Christian missions later added biblical Noah. In some communities today, you can hear a blended tale. An angry God, a righteous man warned to build a boat, and also a named local river that breaks its banks, a particular mountain that shelters survivors, a village ancestor remembered as one of them. Tracing exact lines of influence is hard. Written sources for many African regions are late, and oral literature is dynamic, it adapts. A story about an ancestral river flood 1,000 years ago can absorb motifs about Noah or Nu in the last few centuries without losing its local core. When you listen closely, you hear layers, a cosmology in which all land rose from water, a historical memory of a disastrous flood or lake expansion, later imported ideas about universal judgment and salvation, and underneath all that, the same cautions we've seen elsewhere. Don't treat African flood myths as a single thing. A Yoruba story tied to the Drissa of rain and rivers is not the same as a Berber tale from North Africa's dry valleys, or a Swahili story shaped by monsoon tides. Each grows from particular waterscapes, predictable Nile floods, capricious flash floods in drylands, slowly swelling lakes that can eat ashore over generations. What they often share is this: water marks the boundary between order and its undoing. If people keep their obligations to gods, to ancestors, to guests, to the land, the river stays in its channel and the lake in its basin. If they don't, the world can soften and slide back toward the flood it once emerged from. Which brings us to the deeper puzzle running through all these traditions, from Mesopotamia to the Pacific Northwest to the Niger Delta. Why do so many of the details rhyme? Why the survivors on high ground or in boats, the moral failures, the chance to start again? When you lay all these stories side by side, the phrase, "they're all the same," starts to look lazy. But so does, "oh, it's all just coincidence." The truth lives in the pattern. Start with the first cluster. The warning. Again and again, someone gets a heads up. A dream that won't let go, a talking animal, a god who leans down and whispers, "It's coming." Sometimes it's explicit, like the Mesopotamian gods quietly telling Atrahasis to dismantle his house and build a boat. Sometimes it's softer, strange omens, unseasonal rains, ancestors appearing in visions in the Americas or Oceania saying, "Move to higher ground." From a storytelling point of view, warnings do a lot of work. They create suspense. You, the listener, now know more than the doomed village going about its business below. They also make survival feel earned. The hero isn't just lucky. They listened, they interpreted, they acted when others didn't. The warning marks them as different. Psychologically, it maps to something universal. Our brains are prediction engines. We're wired to look for signs, darker clouds, unusual tides, the way animals behave before an earthquake. Societies that get good at reading those signs survive more often. So, of course, their myths feature people who notice early and prepare. That's what you want your children to emulate. Next comes the vessel. Once you accept that too much water is coming, the next intuitive thought is what floats? Boat, chest, hollowed out log, upside down drum, sealed with pitch. Myth after myth packs people or animals or seeds into something that can ride out the chaos. If you live in a floodplain, you don't need to borrow that idea from anyone. Every rainy season you see canoes tied to trees, grain stored on rafts, people moving by boat where, a few months earlier, they walked. The line between seasonal flood and the time when the water didn't go back is not a conceptual leap. It's a scaling up of lived experience. In many stories, the vessel also solves a narrative problem. A flood that destroys everything risks wiping out the cast entirely. The ark, canoe, or woven basket is a portable plot bubble. It lets the story follow a few chosen beings into the new world. And it lets the storyteller choose who matters. A righteous family, a trickster, a culture hero, a bag of seeds, a pair of every animal. Which brings us to the animals. Pairing animals up is not as universal as it sometimes sounds in children's picture books, but animal rescue itself is common. In some versions of the Manu story in India, the fish that warns him also asks to be protected and carried as it grows, creating a reciprocal bond. In Andean and North American stories, a small surviving group may take along domesticated animals or be followed by wild ones. Elsewhere, animals don't ride the boat, but they perform the crucial labour afterward, diving to the depths to bring back a scrap of mud to rebuild land. On a practical level, herding and farming societies know that without animals, there is no normal life afterwards. On a symbolic level, preserving other life forms makes the hero feel like a caretaker of creation, not just a lone survivor clawing through disaster. Then there's the landing place. High ground, a mountain peak, a lone hill, a temple on a ridge. Over and over, the vessel or the survivors come to rest above the drowned world. Sometimes it's a named place you can still visit. Sometimes it's a mythic first hill that doubles as a creation site. Again, this is exactly what you would expect if you've ever watched floodwaters rise. People flee to ridges, roofs, trees. Communities that regularly experience flooding know, in their bones, which piece of high ground is safe. Tying the end of the world to that familiar refuge reinforces local geography. This is where our ancestors survived. This is why this hill is sacred. The mountain also divides time. Below, the old world is gone. Above, a tiny remnant waits for the waters to fall. It's a clean before-after line, a horizon between judgment and renewal. When the waters finally recede, another cluster appears: sacrifice, promise, covenant. In many Near Eastern and biblical traditions, the first act on dry land is an altar and burnt offerings. In some Pacific and African stories, the survivors thank the river or sea with gifts, taboos, or new ceremonies. Among certain Native American groups, the animals that helped in the flood are honoured with restrictions on how and when they may be hunted. These rituals do several things at once. They acknowledge debt. We lived. Something bigger than us allowed it. They try to stabilise the future. If we behave like this, maybe the waters won't rise like that again. And they close the narrative loop. Destruction began with a broken relationship between humans and gods, humans and ancestors, humans and the land, and ends with that relationship repaired, or at least renegotiated. Sometimes the repair gets an image: a rainbow, a bird with an olive branch. A particular type of cloud in other cultures. There's no rainbow covenant, but there is an equivalent sign, a star pattern, a rock formation, a seasonal wind that means the danger has passed. These work as emotional anchors. After telling your child about the time the world drowned, you can point to something gentle in the sky and say, "That's how we know it won't be like that again, if we keep the rules." Underneath all of this is the double nature of water itself. Water is life. Rivers, rains, monsoons, snowmelt, they make agriculture possible. They carry fish, silt, trade. They're woven into fertility rites, blessings, initiation ceremonies. To be far from water in most pre-industrial contexts is to be close to death. But too much water at the wrong time is annihilation. A river leaving its banks doesn't just knock down houses, it scrapes away fields, silts up wells, drowns grain stores, spreads disease. The same element that keeps you alive can erase your whole settlement in a night. That ambivalence makes water the perfect mythic reset tool. Turn up the dial and the world doesn't just get punished, it gets unmade back into the fluid chaos many cosmologies say it came from. Once you notice how much of this grows straight out of shared human experience, you can be cautious about claiming direct borrowing every time two traditions echo each other. Survival by boat in a river valley, warnings through dreams fleeing to hills, ritually thanking the water afterward, those motifs can arise independently in any flood-prone society. But then there are the stranger rhymes, a god who regrets the flood and weeps, and whose tears themselves become new waters. An almost comically specific instruction about cubits and decks and pitch. A bird sent out 3 times, different species in different versions, all testing whether the land has reappeared. A trick of language where the name of the flood hero in one culture sounds suspiciously like the name or epithet of a figure in a neighbouring culture's story. Lists of survivors that are not just a family but 8 people, 7 couples, a man, his 3 sons and their wives. These are the kinds of details that make comparative mythologists sit up a little straighter. They're not as easily explained by universal psychology or environment. They might point to very old lines of diffusion, stories carried along trade routes, reworked across languages, polished by priests and poets, long before anyone wrote them down, or they might not. Oral traditions change, fold in new material, forget old pieces, converge by chance in ways that are hard to quantify. Without time machines, we can't be sure whether a shared image, say, a boat snagged on a specific mountain, is a sign of direct borrowing, a coincidence, or 2 cultures separately honouring a real landmark where floods often strand debris. What we can say is that the big motif clusters, warning, vessel, animals, high ground, sacrifice, sign, are not random. They're durable because they do so much work at once. They turn chaotic memories of disaster into a clean story with a beginning, middle, and end. They justify why some lived and others didn't. They elevate the survivors into heroes, chosen or clever or obedient. They lay down rules meant to keep the next generation safer, morally and practically. And they give a shape to the most unsettling lesson humans have learnt from living beside water, that the world you know can dissolve, and that starting again is both a terror and a gift. To understand how much of this might be rooted in actual waters rising slowly, or all at once, we have to leave myth for a moment and look at rocks, shorelines, and drowned valleys. Because while the stories talk about gods, the planet itself has its own record of floods. The planet's last great flood began in geological terms with a thaw. About 20,000 years ago, at the height of the last ice age, so much water was locked up in ice sheets that global sea level was more than 100 meters lower than it is now. North America wore a crust of ice a mile thick. Northern Europe was buried. Mounting glaciers reached much farther down their valleys. The world map would have looked uncanny. New land bridges, swollen continental shelves, coastlines pushed far out into what is now open sea. Then the climate shifted. Not overnight, not in a single disaster movie moment, but in pulses. Temperatures inched upward. Summer melt lasted a little longer each year. Glaciers thinned, retreated, collapsed. Enormous ice sheets started pouring their stored water back into the oceans. Over roughly 10,000 years, global sea level climbed more than 100 meters. If you compress that into a single human lifetime, you get something like the flood myths describe. But even stretched out over millennia, it was fast in planetary terms, and relentless. What did that look like to people who lived through slices of it? Imagine being part of a small coastal community 10,000 years ago on a shoreline that no longer exists. When your grandparents were young, the village was farther out, near a fishing ground that's now too deep to see. They tell stories of fruit trees that once grew where you now wade. The old path to the shrine is gone. The shrine itself was moved inland after a storm chewed half of it away. The sea doesn't rise like a bathtub, it comes in surges. A storm drives waves farther than anyone remembers. Next year's high tide reaches the same line, even on a calm day. Salt fingers creep up the river, turning fresh drinking water brackish and killing crops along the banks. Wells go bad. Mangroves march inland. A low-lying hunting ground, once dry for most of the year, spends longer and longer under water until it becomes marsh, then lagoon. From one lifetime to the next, the change is just on the edge of normal. Annoying, dangerous, but maybe survivable with a bigger seawall, a new field, a move a few 100 meters upriver. From 10 lifetimes away, looking back through layers of memory, it starts to fuse into something else. The time the sea would not stop coming. This is how a slow flood becomes a single story. Each generation passes down its own piece. The year the river turned salty, the year the cemetery washed away, the season when the fish moved, and the elder said, "It was not like this in our time." Oral tradition pulls those beads together on one string. You no longer have 1,000 small encroachments. You have an age when the waters rose and the first lands were lost. Geologists can trace this in the rocks and mud. Drowned river valleys, rhyas and fjords mark where rivers once cut through dry land and now open into the sea. Continental shelves preserve the ghost outlines of shorelines that human feet almost certainly walked. In some places we find ancient hearths, tools, even peat bogs now lying tens of meters underwater. relics of forests and wetlands that used to be above the tide line. Archaeologists, meanwhile, have a problem. Most of the best places to live at the end of the Ice Age, river mouths, gentle coastal plains, shallow bays, are exactly the places that got drowned. Any villages, shrines, or fields that might have seeded early flood stories are now under tens of meters of water, buried in sediment, difficult and expensive to reach. Our picture of early coastal life is biased toward the few regions where the land has risen as the sea did, or where chance has preserved an ancient shoreline above present sea level. That means we're likely missing a huge chapter of human experience. Thousands of years of people watching shorelines creep inland, losing ancestral graves and hunting grounds, and adapting, retreating, arguing with the sea. Does that prove there was the Great Flood behind all the myths? No. The timing doesn't line up neatly. Local sea level rise varied by region, and the most dramatic episodes were long before many of our written traditions. But it does give us a powerful backdrop. For many of our ancestors, especially between roughly 15 and 6,000 years ago, the world really was shrinking at the edges. Water really was claiming land that grandparents swore had always been dry. Whole landscapes were, quite literally, drowned. If you live on a coast that keeps walking toward you, if every few generations your people must abandon another strip of homeland to an encroaching sea, it makes sense that, eventually, you don't tell your children, once upon a time, the sea rose very slowly for thousands of years. You tell them, once, long ago, the waters came up and took the world. Slow floods carved themselves into memory as eras. Fast floods carve themselves into memory as screams. Because not all floods creep. Some arrive like an ambush. 1 hour the world is ordinary. The next, it feels like the gods have overturned the sky and poured the ocean on your head. If you're looking for events that could plausibly become the great flood of a region in a single story, this is where geology gets suddenly, brutally helpful. Start with the fastest, tsunamis. A tsunami isn't just a big wave. It's a whole chunk of sea, displaced by something violent, a submarine earthquake, a landslide, a volcanic flank collapsing into the water. Out in deep ocean, a tsunami can pass beneath a ship as a gentle swell a meter or two high, racing along at jetliner speeds. But when that surge hits shallow coastal waters, it slows down, bunches up, and piles its energy into a tower of moving sea. To someone standing on shore, there's often no wall of water at first. The warning sign, when there is one, is uncanny. The sea draws back, exposing seafloor that has never been dry in living memory. Fish flopping on wet sand, boats suddenly stranded. People walk out to stare, to gather shellfish. Minutes later, the first surge arrives. Not a breaking wave, but a fast rising tide that doesn't stop. It lifts houses from their foundations, uproots trees, grinds villages into drifting debris. In extreme cases, it can push kilometres inland, turn river mouths into backwards flowing rapids, and chew whole sections out of the coastline. We don't have to speculate about how this feels. In 2004, along the edges of the Indian Ocean, people watched the sea go away and come back as a killing flood. In Japan in 2011, entire towns vanished under a roiling wall of debris-laden water. Survivors often describe it as if the ocean itself stood up and walked onto land. Now imagine smaller but still devastating versions of that happening in prehistory, when whole cultures might be strung out along a single low coast tied to one harbour, one delta. The Mediterranean has a long record of tsunamis, triggered by faults under the seafloor and by volcanic activity from places like Santorini and Etna. The Pacific Ring of Fire is even worse. Subduction zones off Japan, the Pacific Northwest, Chile, New Zealand, all capable of sending multi-story waves onto land. The Indian Ocean has undersea faults too, plus volcanic islands with unstable flanks. To people who lived beside these seas, a big tsunami didn't just wreck a village. It trashed a world, boats, shrines, fields, graveyards, the entire visible coastline, all in an afternoon. If every community you know sits around that same bay, and most of them are gone by sunset, it's not a stretch to tell your grandchildren that, in your youth, the sea rose up and drowned the earth. Move inland and the disasters change shape, but not their speed. Rivers don't always stay politely in their channels. They can jump. Geologists call this an avulsion. A river builds up sediment in its own bed until the water starts to spill sideways, cuts a shortcut, and suddenly adopts a whole new course across its floodplain. Sometimes this is gradual. Sometimes it's violently fast, especially when something gives way upstream. That something is often a dam that no engineer signed off on, a natural wall of ice, rock, or sediment holding back an enormous lake. Picture a valley in the shadow of a glacier, tens of kilometers long, quietly filling with meltwater behind a plug of ice, or a landslide blocking a mountain river, turning a gorge into a deep, cold reservoir. These lakes can sit for years, decades, even centuries looking stable. Then one hot summer or one earthquake or one extra heavy storm shifts the balance. The dam fails, not gracefully, it tears open. What happens next is not a normal flood. When a natural dam breaks, all that stored water is suddenly free to obey gravity. It roars down valley as a wall of mud, boulders, broken trees and water, higher than houses, moving at highway speeds. It scours the valley floor to bedrock, rips out forests, strips soil, buries anything in its way under meters of sediment. In some of the classic cases we can reconstruct, towns downstream would have had, at most, minutes of warning. Many would not have understood what was happening until the sound arrived, a grinding, roaring thunder that was already too close. In the high latitudes during and after the last ice age, this happened at scales so large they're almost hard to accept. Glacial outburst floods geologists call them Deucalion in Iceland, and the name has stuck, emptied lakes the size of small seas in days or hours. In western North America, the repeated draining of glacial Lake Missoula sent flows hundreds of meters deep, racing across what is now Washington state, carving the channeled scablands, dry cataracts and gouged rock that look like the footprints of an absent ocean. In Central Asia and Northern Europe, other proglacial lakes failed catastrophically, ripping new channels, rearranging entire river systems in a geological blink. Nobody was writing myths at the time of the biggest of these Ice Age megafloods, and we should be cautious about tying any named story directly to events that happened 15,000 or 12,000 years ago. But the mechanism doesn't vanish with the great ice sheets. Smaller glacial lakes still burst in the Andes and Himalayas. Landslide dams still fail in mountain ranges from the Caucasus to the Rockies. Historical records from China, India and the Mediterranean include episodes where the river rose and swept away 10,000 homes in a single day. Scale that into a world where your world is one valley, and it does feel like everything. So what can these events explain? They give us a menu of realistic, regional cataclysms. A tsunami that obliterates a whole string of fishing communities around a bay. A dam burst that scours an entire river valley down to bare rock and rearranges the channels. A sudden avulsion that turns the old city into a swamp and a dusty backwater into the new main channel. For the people who live there, these are, quite literally, world-ending floods. They don't need water to cover Mount Everest to feel apocalyptic. But if we want to connect specific myths to specific disasters, we have to be careful. Geologists don't just point to a dramatic story and say, "That sounds big, must be a tsunami." They look for physical traces, thick layers of sand and marine shells washed far inland, where they don't belong, draped over older soils, chaotic high-energy deposits in river valleys, boulders jumbled together in ways that only extreme flows can produce, fine layers of silt and clay in lake bottoms that show sudden pulses of sediment, datable by radiocarbon or trapped volcanic ash. In some cases, they can match a tsunami sand layer to a known earthquake on a particular fault. In others, they can estimate how much water roared through a valley from the size of the channels it cut. The more precisely we can date those layers, the more honestly we can compare them to the timelines of human settlement and to whatever oral or written traditions we have. Sometimes the match is intriguing, sometimes it isn't. And there's a constant temptation, especially in popular media, to flip that process, to start with a dramatic legend and go hunting for a great flood layer that will make headlines, smoothing over uncertainties and exaggerating the scale. For our purposes, it's enough to say this. The geology of the last 20 or 30,000 years is choked with big sudden floods that were absolutely real, terrifying, and, from a local point of view, total. They didn't drown the planet. They didn't need to. All they had to do was drown someone's whole horizon. The rest, how that memory spreads, mutates, and links up with slower, longer floods, is the work of culture. If you've ever gone looking for the scientific explanation behind the story of Noah's flood, you've probably met one particular suspect, the Black Sea. The basic idea is simple enough to picture. At the end of the last ice age, sea level was still rising, but it hadn't yet connected every basin the way it does today. According to the more dramatic version of the hypothesis, the Black Sea started out as a much smaller, mostly freshwater lake, sitting hundreds of meters below the level of the Mediterranean. Between them, across what is now the Bosporus, lay a natural plug of land and sediment. On one side, farmers and fishing villages lived around a broad, fertile shoreline. On the other, the Mediterranean kept creeping higher as the global oceans filled. Then one day, geologically speaking, the plug gave way. In the classic telling, this was a catastrophe in slow motion that still would have felt terrifyingly fast. Mediterranean water, now higher than the Black Sea basin, began pouring through the Bosporus like a broken dam, carving the strait, raising the Black Sea level tens of centimeters a day, maybe meters a week. Low-lying coastal villages would have watched the shoreline retreat uphill season by season. Fields, graves, houses, whole communities disappearing under a rising sheet of foreign, salty water. From the point of view of those people, the gods really had opened a gate and let another sea crash in. This picture, first popularized in the 1990s by geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman, was irresistible. It sits right next door to Mesopotamia and Anatolia, regions that later produced some of our most famous flood stories. It offers a single, spectacular event in roughly the right part of the world, a source flood that refugees could have remembered, carried south and east, and woven into myths about a great deluge that wiped the slate clean. But when you dig into the details, almost every piece of that picture is up for debate. There's broad agreement that the Black Sea's level has changed, and that at some point there was a connection event between it and the Mediterranean. What's not agreed on is how big, how fast, or exactly when. Some studies suggest a large, rapid inflow around 7,600 years ago. Others argue for a smaller, more gradual rise, or even for times when the Black Sea may have been slightly higher than the Mediterranean, flowing the other way. Timing is especially tricky. Those famous Mesopotamian flood texts. They're much later than 5600 BCE. The flood layers archaeologists have found in some Near Eastern cities, possibly recording big regional river floods. Those mostly date to the 3rd millennium BCE or later. Oral traditions can in principle preserve memories for thousands of years, but tying a written story from, say, 1700 BCE directly to a geological event 4,000 years earlier is a long, uncertain bridge. Even the rate of flooding is contested. Ryan and Pittman's early calculations made it sound apocalyptic, shorelines racing uphill, villages drowned within a human lifetime. Later work has argued that the numbers might be much more modest, coastlines migrating inland over generations, noticeable and disruptive, but not a single-season catastrophe. That difference matters if you're trying to imagine what kind of story people would tell. A slow, creeping loss makes for a very different memory than a single night when all the fountains of the great deep burst forth. Still, the Black Sea Deluge has something many hypotheses lack: a clean narrative hook, a once isolated basin, a rising global ocean, a narrow threshold between them. It feels like a myth already. It's not the only candidate of its kind. Around the Mediterranean and beyond, geologists and historians have pointed to other regional big floods that could have seeded local deluge stories. In Mesopotamia itself, the Tigris and Euphrates occasionally break their banks in ways that are anything but ordinary. Sediment cores and archaeological layers show episodes where floodwaters buried entire urban levels under meters of river mud. If your world is a single alluvial plain, and the water rises until the city walls vanish, you don't need a sea gate. The sky opened, the earth dissolved, and the gods had clearly decided to start over. Farther east, there are proposals that sudden overflows or reroutings of big river basins, the Indus, the Yellow River, the Yangtze, could lie behind specific cultural memories. The Yellow River in particular has a reputation, even in historical times, as China's sorrow, shifting course across its floodplain, occasionally leaping to entirely new channels and submerging thousands of square kilometers of farmland. In Southeast Asia, changes in monsoon strength and in the level of inland seas like the Sunda Shelf have been suggested as the slow background to more sudden events. A village that wakes up one generation to find the sea permanently closer, the tides reaching where they never have before. In Northern Europe, some researchers have asked whether the catastrophic breaching of the land bridge between Britain and the continent, the flooding of what's now the English Channel, and the drowning of the lowland Doggerland in the North Sea could echo faintly in later myths about lands swallowed by the sea. In the Persian Gulf, others have imagined a drowned Eden on the old river plains that now lie beneath shallow salt water, supplying a setting for stories about a lost, well-watered land. All of these theories share an attractive logic. They take a mythic claim, once long ago the waters rose and remade the world, and pair it with a geological process that really can, under the right circumstances, raise waters and remake a world. A collapsed isthmus, a burst natural dam, a river that abandons its bed, a continental shelf that goes from dry land to shallow sea within a few thousand years. They give us something to point at on a map and say, maybe here, but methodologically there's a trap lurking. If you start with a story and go hunting for any impressive flood you can find within 1,000 kilometers and a few thousand years, you will almost always find something. River systems flood, coasts erode, lakes overtop their basins. The Holocene is busy, correlation in space and approximate time is easy to claim, hard to prove. And once a particular match becomes popular, Noah's flood was the Black Sea, Atlantis was Doggerland, it tends to stick in the public imagination long after specialists have moved on to more cautious language. The responsible way around this is slow and unglamorous. Date the sediments as precisely as you can. Date the human settlements above and below them. Look for archaeological signs of sudden abandonment or migration that line up with the flood layer. Ask whether the affected region plausibly feeds into the later literary or oral traditions in question, through known routes of trade, conquest, or cultural influence. And even when all those stars line up, remember that stories mutate. A memory of a long, miserable century of creeping shoreline loss can, over generations, become a tale of one terrible year when the ocean leapt. So why do hypotheses like the Black Sea Deluge refuse to die even under skeptical scrutiny? Partly because they offer something we're hungry for, a bridge between the tangible, datable world of rocks and shorelines and the intangible, drifting world of story. They tell us that when our ancestors spoke about the day the waters rose and the old world ended, they might not have been talking only in metaphors. There could have been a ruined harbour, a drowned field, an abandoned village under the waves somewhere, anchoring the tale. And even where the match isn't exact, these regional big flood candidates remind us of a deeper truth. You don't need a planet-wide ocean to generate a myth of total drowning. All you need is a basin, a threshold, and water with somewhere to go. The global flood, in that sense, may be less about one single event, and more about a pattern, a recurring kind of disaster, waiting for culture to give it a name. When you zoom out from the rocks and riverbeds and start looking at maps of people instead, another pattern appears. Stories move, they don't drift randomly like pollen. They ride on very specific carriers, feet on roads, keels on water, tongues in marketplaces. In the ancient world, merchants were some of the most powerful storytellers on earth. Not because they set out to be, because boredom is deadly, and talking passes time. Picture a caravan moving along the old trade routes between Mesopotamia, Anatolia, the Levant, the Iranian plateau. Days of walking, nights around a shared fire. You swap prices, rumours, and then, when that runs out, you swap stories. The old flood that wiped away your grandfather's village. The boat builder who survived when others drowned. The god who swore never to do it again. Sailors did something similar along coasts and river mouths. Ports are natural story hubs. People from 10 different language groups crammed into the same taverns and warehouses. A captain from Dilmun hears about a terrible river flood in the north and brings that version home. By the time it's retold on an island in the Gulf or the Indus Delta, the river has changed. The god has a different name, but the arc is familiar. Humanity drowned, one family saved, a covenant sealed when the waters fall. Intermarriage moves tales in a quieter way. A daughter married off from one city-state to another brings more than her dowry. She brings her childhood cosmology, the lullabies her mother sang, the explanation for why people plant when they do, why they sacrifice before crossing a river. Children raised at that border absorb 2 versions of the world and start blending them. Scribes and priests move stories more consciously. When literate elites of one kingdom come into contact with another, through trade, diplomacy, or conquest, they sometimes copy texts verbatim, sometimes adapt them. A flood narrative that was once an ode to a Mesopotamian god of storms becomes, in another temple, a story about a highland weather deity or a river spirit. The frame stays. The cast changes. Missionaries and captives oddly can play similar roles. A deported population forced into exile brings its festivals and foundation myths. Over generations, those stories may seep into the host culture's imagination, especially if they offer powerful explanations for suffering and survival. A prophet in bondage saying, "Once before the world was washed clean, and a remnant was saved," is planting a seed that can sprout into scripture centuries later. Every time a story moves, it changes. A flood myth that starts in a flat river plain, where the horizon is nothing but sky and water, will look different once it crosses into a mountain culture. Suddenly, there are peaks for the ark to rest on. Local landmarks get pulled into the plot. This hill, that sacred rock, that particular bend in the river where the water first went down. The gods who send the deluge acquire local names, local tempers. In one place, the flood punishes noise and overpopulation. In another, it punishes broken oaths. In another, it's not punishment at all, but cosmic housekeeping before a new age of kings. Moral emphases shift too. In some retellings, the hero survives because he's righteous. In others, because he's clever, or simply lucky enough to be warned. A new ruling dynasty might prefer the righteous version. We are here because we were chosen, preserved from destruction. A shrewd merchant class might favour the clever survivor who listens to secret whispers and builds ahead of time. This is where the idea of mythic prestige comes in. Some stories become famous. They are known to be old, to belong to great, ancient cities or powerful temples. Attaching yourself to one of those narratives can be a way of claiming legitimacy. If you're a newer kingdom on the block, and you've heard that the mighty cities of the southern plains tell of a primeval deluge, one temptation is to say, "Ah, yes, that flood. Our ancestors survived it too. Our God was there. Our sacred mountain is where the boat landed." You're not just borrowing a story, you're borrowing time, antiquity, authority. The ancient Near East, with its dense web of city-states, its early writing systems, and its long-distance trade, is an especially plausible hub for this kind of textual prestige. We can actually watch motifs travel there. Versions of the Atrahasis and Gilgamesh flood episodes show up, in altered form, far from their original scribal homes. Themes, phrases, even the sequence of events echo across centuries and languages. It would be surprising if at least some later flood narratives in that wider region weren't shaped, directly or indirectly, by that Mesopotamian core. But that doesn't mean every flood story on Earth is descended from one cuneiform tablet. Cultural diffusion is powerful, but it has limits. Trade routes thin out, empires fall apart. Whole continents had little or no contact with Southwest Asia for tens of thousands of years. When we find flood myths there, with their own local animals, their own mountains, their own moral logic, independent invention becomes the simpler explanation. After all, big floods really happen. Human minds are wired to tell certain kinds of stories about them. Beginnings and endings, guilt and grace, loss and renewal. Sometimes those stories spread like traded goods. Sometimes they arise like wildflowers in different fields, after the same kind of storm. The puzzle is working out, case by case, which is which. If stories can move like goods on a caravan, it's worth asking why some cargo is so popular. Why floods? One answer is that flood myths are more than entertainment. They're social technology. Imagine living in a landscape where water is both your lifeline and your biggest threat. The same river that feeds your crops can, in a bad season, erase your entire village by breakfast. You can't take that lightly, but you also can't spend every day in a panic. So you build something in between, a story. Again and again, flood myths lay out rules for how to live together before the water rises. In Mesopotamia, people are punished when the world becomes too noisy, too crowded, too out of balance. In many native North American traditions, the flood comes after people forget proper respect for animals or stop sharing fairly. In parts of Oceania, survivors are those who show hospitality to a wandering god or who listen to the quiet person nobody else takes seriously. Humility, hospitality, restraint, listening to warnings, these aren't abstract virtues. They're behaviours that keep a small, fragile community functioning under stress. A story where the whole world drowns if you ignore those norms is an efficient teaching tool. Children don't have to understand river hydraulics. They just have to understand when the old woman says, "Don't mock the sea," you don't mock the sea. At the same time, flood myths act as instruction manuals for disaster preparedness, written in the only medium most people had, narrative. Look at what the heroes actually do. Atrahasis stores grain, loads animals. Noah gathers food. Many Pacific flood heroes lash multiple canoes together, bring fire-making tools, gourds, seeds. Even when the stories become more theological, those practical details hang on. They are, in effect, a syllabus. When the sky looks wrong, don't just pray. Build, store, cooperate. Some Andean and Himalayan traditions add another layer. People survive not because they are isolated geniuses, but because they work with others or pay attention to a web of relationships with animals, with spirits, with neighbours who know the signs. That encodes a very specific lesson. In a real flood, lone wolves die. Networks live. There's a power dimension too. Floods are perfect backstories for authority. If your people remember a time when everything familiar vanished underwater, whoever led them through that chaos, or claims descent from the ones who did, can claim unusual legitimacy. Founders in Mesopotamia, China, and elsewhere are often linked to taming or channeling waters. Yu the Great doesn't just get famous for having a good idea about dikes, he becomes the ancestor of dynasties. In smaller scale societies, the chief or ritual specialist who knows what to do when the river comes is not an ordinary person. Their prestige is tied to a remembered catastrophe. This pattern repeats in more symbolic ways. Kings and priests like to say, before us, chaos, after us, order. A flood myth is the ultimate version of that slogan. Once the gods swept everything away. Afterwards they or their chosen human drew lines, set rules, promised stability. To plug yourself into that story is to say, my authority exists to keep you from drowning again. Why are floods, specifically, so good for these reset stories? Because, unlike a fire or a plague, a big flood literally redraws the map. River courses shift, islands appear and vanish, fertile silt covers old boundaries. Your grandfather's fields are now part of the riverbed. Yesterday's high ground is today's marsh. When the water finally goes down, people walk out into a landscape that feels like a new world. That physical erasure makes it easier to imagine social erasure. Old debts, old hierarchies, old grudges, washed away with the boundary stones. You can tell a story where the previous age was corrupt and the new age is purified, because the land itself seems to agree. Look, the village is gone. The god must have meant it. That's also why these myths are so good at absorbing new moral messages. A later reformer can stand up and say, the flood came because of injustice, or because of idolatry, or because people stopped honouring contracts, and the basic frame still works. The water erased the old order. Now we will build the right one. In the middle of all this, a quick pause in our own story. If you like following these deep, winding threads between geology, myth, and memory, there's a book on the channel's website that dives into 12 of the strangest historical mysteries we know. It's in the description, and there's a discount running this week if you want something to fall asleep to that isn't a screen. Back to the floods. When you look at them this way, the question, did this really happen, becomes more complicated. In a strict journalistic sense, most flood myths are not eyewitness reports. They compress centuries into days, turn many disasters into one, personify weather as a single angry being. They aren't precise hydrology, but they can still be true in another sense. They remember in a distilled way that water regimes change, that landscapes are unstable, that human behaviour has consequences, that survival depends on cooperation, foresight, and humility. They encode the knowledge that power often justifies itself by claiming to have rescued people from chaos. They carry, buried in the silt of story, hard-won lessons from generations who watched the river rise higher than anyone expected. You don't have to believe that every mountaintop boat was real to recognize yourself in these patterns. We still live beside dangerous water, now often in the form of sea level rise, swollen storm systems, and dams that might fail. We still tell ourselves that we're different, more advanced, safer. The ancients would have nodded politely and then asked a simple question. When the flood comes, have you agreed on what kind of people you're going to be? Because for them, that was the real work of the myth. Not predicting the next storm, but deciding, in advance, how not to lose your humanity when the waters start to climb. So, after all of this, we circle back to the tempting question. Could there have been one flood? Not just a bad year on the local river, not a coastline slowly drowning over centuries, but a single world-drowning event behind all these stories. To answer that, we have to be clear about what global would actually mean. Physically global doesn't just mean a lot of places got wet. It means water high enough to cover every major landmass, all at roughly the same time, to a depth that would put even mountain ranges under the surface. Oceans would have to rise not by a few meters, but by several kilometers. Where would that water come from? You can't get it from rain alone. If you try to imagine enough rainfall to raise the oceans by even a few hundred meters in 40 days and 40 nights, the numbers go strange very fast. The atmosphere simply cannot hold that much water vapor. To dump it that quickly globally, you'd need energy inputs that would boil oceans, not gently fill them. The heat released by condensing that much water would make the air itself lethal. You don't get a wet planet, you get a steam planet. You also can't get it by melting ice sheets overnight. At the end of the last ice age, when enormous glaciers really did sit on North America and Eurasia, global sea level rose by about 120 meters as they melted. That's already enough to redraw coastlines and swallow whole continental shelves. But it happened over thousands of years with shorter pulses that might have raised the sea by a few meters per century, or, in the most dramatic cases, perhaps a meter or so in a human lifetime. That is terrifying if you live on a low-lying coast. It is not the kind of thing that takes the Himalayas for a swim. And if the entire planet had been underwater in the geologically recent past, the rocks would tell us. Sedimentary layers would show a distinctive global signature, the same marine deposits from the same window of time, on every continent, stacked directly over soil that had held terrestrial life and directly under the soils we stand on now. We don't see that. What we do see is a patchwork, clear evidence for enormous regional floods, but at different times and in different places. Outburst floods when glacial lakes burst their ice or rock dams and sent walls of water roaring across what is now Montana and Washington. Tsunamis from earthquakes and submarine landslides, tearing into coastal settlements without warning. Sudden shifts in river courses that drowned one valley while leaving the next surprisingly dry. Episodes of sea level rise that ate away at old shorelines and turned familiar hills into isolated islands. From the point of view of geology, then, a single recent worldwide flood that reset everything at once doesn't fit easily into the evidence. You have to bend a lot of well-supported data to make it work. This is why many historians, archaeologists and geologists prefer a different picture. Instead of one global flood, imagine many regional catastrophes spread over millennia, sharing a few common patterns. People build along coasts and rivers because that's where the food is. Water systems are unstable, climate can shift, ice sheets collapse in pulses. Occasionally, everything you know is washed away. Now add something else we've already talked about. Humans talking to each other. Trade routes carry goods, marriage partners, songs and stories. People migrate out of flooded lands and tell those they meet, "We came from a place that drowned." Empires expand and impose their own prestige myths, which quietly absorb older local tales. Priests and poets take raw memory and polish it into theology and literature. After long enough, you don't just have one people's flood story. You have a cloud of stories, borrowing images from each other: the angry sky, the warning dream, the boat, the mountain, the dove, the rainbow, the god who promises not to do it again. The details differ, but the emotional core rhymes. For scholars, this mosaic model has two advantages. First, it fits the physical evidence. Lots of water, lots of times, in lots of places. Not one neat global event. Second, it matches what we know about culture, stories, travel. They blend, they get reused. A powerful narrative about divine judgment or cosmic reset is too useful to stay put. That doesn't mean we have to reduce everything to spreadsheets and sediment cores and say, case closed, nothing mysterious here. There's another layer. A truly catastrophic local flood can feel global from the inside. If every village you've ever traded with is gone, if the landmarks your grandparents named you after are underwater, if the roots that tied your world together are erased, and weeks of walking in any direction only bring you to more mud, more corpses, more drifting roofs, then, for all practical purposes, the world has ended. Your world is not a blue marble seen from space. It is a network of places and people that fits in your head. When that network breaks, it is not unreasonable to speak in absolutes. Everything, everyone, the whole earth. Later generations looking back through that language may imagine a physically global event. The rock record suggests something else. Many worlds ending, one after another, overlapping and echoing. As you drift towards sleep, you can hold both possibilities in your mind without forcing them to fight. On one side, the strict physical planet, with its measured sea levels and its reluctance to produce a single tidy worldwide flood. On the other, the lived human planet, where each community's horizon is its cosmos, and water that reaches that horizon might as well have washed over the stars. Between them lies a more honest answer. Not one great deluge, but a long, uneven age of drownings. Tsunamis, river bursts, collapsing ice dams, centuries of creeping sea, all feeding into a shared vocabulary of fear and renewal. Local disasters turned, by memory and imagination, into something that feels universal, a patchwork of floods, a mosaic of causes, and beneath it all a single persistent intuition that the ground under our feet is not guaranteed, that the waters can rise, and that who we are when they do is, in the end, the story that matters most. So when you zoom out past individual rivers and lost coastlines, what are we actually looking at? Across Mesopotamia, India, China, the Mediterranean, the Pacific, the Americas, Africa, the same shapes keep surfacing. A world that forgets its limits, water that arrives as judgment, or accident, or both. A small remnant who survive by foresight, help from the divine, or sheer luck. A high place, or a boat, or both. A reset, a chance, and a warning threaded together. Geology and archaeology offer more than one way to explain that pattern. Part of it is almost certainly the slow, patient violence of post-Ice Age sea level rise. For thousands of years, shorelines crept inland. Places that had always been land became bays and channels. Continental shelves that once held forests and campfires quietly drowned. If your grandparents could walk to a fishing ground that your grandchildren can only reach by boat, that's a flood, even if it took centuries. Layered on top of that are the sharp edges, sudden regional disasters. Glacial lakes that fail all at once, tsunamis that erase coasts in a single morning, rivers that leap their banks and never go back, turning old floodplains into permanent lakes. Each of those is local in the planetary sense, but total in the human sense. Worlds ending, one valley at a time. Then there is diffusion. Stories do not respect watersheds. Merchants on the Euphrates pass tales to sailors on the Persian Gulf, who talk to fishers along the Indian Ocean, who arrive in ports where people already have their own memories of drowned lands. Priests fold those memories into liturgies. Scribes edit them into epics. Empires conquer and carry their prestige myths with them. Over centuries, different floods begin to rhyme, not because they share one physical source, but because they share trade routes, intermarriage, and the human habit of borrowing powerful images. And beneath all of that is something even more basic: what water means to creatures like us. Water is survival, and it is threat. It is the river that feeds your fields and the wave that takes your child. It draws settlements and then reminds them abruptly who is in charge. You don't need a shared historical event for people in distant ages and continents to imagine a world washed clean and remade. You only need to live close to a river that sometimes runs too high. So the recurring motifs, the angry sky, the warning dream, the ark, the mountain, the promise are probably not fingerprints of one single nightmarish storm. They are the grammar we keep reaching for when we talk about change we can't control, about things that end without asking our permission, and the fragile, stubborn continuity that survives on a hilltop somewhere and starts again. None of this has to be all or nothing. It is possible that a few particularly dramatic regional floods, an outburst here, a tsunami there, a drowned coastal plain somewhere else, left marks deep enough to echo through multiple traditions. It is also possible that some details we like to connect never actually touched in history, but converged because our minds are built to tell certain kinds of stories. When the evidence is thin, the most honest posture is a gentle kind of uncertainty. Many drivers overlapping, many memories condensed. Not one answer, but a family of answers that sit alongside each other without quite merging. If you're lying in the dark right now, listening to this as you drift off, you can let the whole mosaic soften a little. Imagine that long, uneven age of drownings. Villages lost to rivers that changed their minds. Coasts nibbled away, generation by generation. Harbours rebuilt farther inland. Parents telling children, the sea was out there once. Each small catastrophe teaching the same lesson in a different accent. The world you know is negotiable. Nothing about the current shoreline is permanent. Maybe that is why the flood never really leaves our myths. It speaks to more than water. It's the story we use whenever the ground shifts, politically, personally, climatically. A way of saying, there was a before and an after, and we lived in the crack between them. We lost things, we carried things, we decided, again, who we wanted to be when the waters went down. As you fall asleep, you can think of yourself as part of that long lineage of listeners. People huddled by fires, in boats, on city rooftops, retelling versions of the same old warning and the same old hope. Tomorrow, the ordinary world will still be there, the dishes, the appointments, the rising seas and the statistics. But somewhere in the deep time behind you, small bands watched rivers rise and chose to remember. Not just what had been destroyed, but how a handful of survivors climbed into a boat or up a mountain and started over. We are their descendants living in the after, telling ourselves again and again that change is real, loss is real, and so is the quiet, stubborn work of rebuilding. If this journey through the world's flood stories helped you relax, or gave you something new to turn over in your mind as you drift off, you can gently tap like or subscribe for more history told at this slower, sleep-friendly pace. If you feel like it, leave a comment and tell us where you're listening from. What coast? What river? What city? What dry land? And if you'd like to go deeper into this deep past, there's a book waiting for you. 12 prehistoric secrets that shaped who we are, including the bottleneck, the floods, and other crises our ancestors survived. You can read more about it or pick up a copy through the link on our website in the description. For now, let the waters recede, let the stories settle, and let yourself rest in the simple, astonishing fact that you are here at all, on this side of so many endings.